So we'll start by setting our motivation. So we reflect on the purpose of the course to familiarize our minds with the wisdom of the Buddha presented to us in the Lamrim, the stages of the path to enlightenment. We think of the purpose of Lama Tsongkhapa crafting the Lamrim, taking all of the essential highest meaning from the sutras, condensing them, organizing them in a way that's suitable for easy understanding without having to do all of that work that Lama Tsongkhapa himself did, studying thousands of pages of sutra material. How fortunate we are to benefit from those efforts of systematizing, condensing, extracting, allowing us to access all of the Buddha's wisdom in a few hundred pages. I think that wisdom is relevant and powerful, reliable, as evidenced by thousands of years of practitioners putting the teachings into practice, getting the results. And that the purpose of that result is to unlock our innate capacity to benefit sentient beings. So these minds of refuge, observing the Buddha and his teachings and the community of practitioners like Lama Tsongkhapa who understand his teachings perfectly. These are the real sources of protection and refuge in the world. And the product of all of those efforts is a path that is dependable, in which we can have great confidence. And that the goal of that path is our own enlightenment, achieved not for our benefit, but for the benefit of others. So these minds of refuge and bodhicitta and faith or confidence we establish as motivation for our time. All right. So we just finished a section talking about rebirth, the intermediate state, a bit about the dissolutions and so on. Any thoughts or questions from last class, last Thursday?
I have a question, Venerable. On Thursday, you were kind enough to describe and to go into detail some of the aspects of the coarse, subtle, and very subtle minds. And often in listening to Venerable Ravina speak, she will advise you to watch your mind like a hawk, so that it doesn't wander. And I'm wondering if that's the coarse mind watching the subtle mind, or is that something else?
Mm, in a way, it might almost be a little bit maybe the reverse, with introspective awareness kind of being almost like a subroutine that we can sort of establish in the mind. Something, it's a capacity of the mind, just like we can tell ourselves that we're going to look at, you know, something, visual form in front of us. We can say, okay, I'm going to just stare at this visual form. There's lots of other things in my environment, but I've decided I'm going to just look at this for 5 minutes. And we can make an effort, of course, in a way that's similar to meditation, but to give a coarser example, an example that is happening with the coarse mind, like our speech, is an example of what's happening with the coarse mind. Um, so, in that example, um, we're giving ourselves an instruction to hold the mind to an object of the sensory consciousness and not to let the mind wander. The mind will want to wander at some point, but with introspective awareness, we notice, okay, that I've started looking around, or I've started doodling, or I've done something other than what I said I would do, and then we just remind ourselves to attend to that visual form. So that instruction is the same instruction that we give ourselves in meditation, whatever the object is, whether it's the breath or whether it's a analytical object. We tell ourselves that I'm not going to analyze other objects. I'm not going to attend to other objects. I'm going to stay whatever, within the bounds of that meditative object is. And some meditative objects are more, have a larger boundary. Like if you're meditating on the 18 qualities of a precious human rebirth, for example, then if you're thinking about the disadvantages of the hell realms, there's a lot of different particular examples that would all be relevant. But if you start thinking about how kind your teacher is in teaching you about the hell realms, that's not relevant to that particular topic. It's a wonderful meditation to do, but it's a separate meditation. So you would have to come back to, well, there's this painful state, there's that painful state. There's, the actual disadvantages of the hell realm is the only bound for that time. And then you might move on to the advantages of a time and place when the Buddha has come and taught. And now you've got a whole range of other examples that are relevant. So as long as it's relevant to the topic, it's fine. My examples might be different than your examples, and your examples on Monday might be different than Tuesday, but as long as it's on the topic, they're all appropriate. But some totally different topic is inappropriate. So you've given yourself the instruction, this is appropriate, this is inappropriate. When something inappropriate happens, I'll bring my mind back to what's appropriate. That is the skill of introspective awareness, and it's continually moving the mind back to what you've said is your intended object or what's appropriate. And so in meditation, that's an example of watching the mind like a hawk, would be really not wanting the mind to wander. But there's only so much you can really do consciously with that. You sort of give yourself the instruction, and then it's like the mind over time with the instruction, you you notice how well you're implementing that instruction. And then just through repetition, really, you get better at implementing that instruction. But you're not really doing anything particularly conscious. You've just programmed the mind in a particular way. And then you take that instruction seriously. And then your mind kind of over time, after months, after years, after decades of just engaging in the instruction, your mind naturally improves in carrying out that instruction. And so it kind of depends on what it is that you're trying to observe. If you're in meditation and the mind is relatively subtle in general, then, you know, because you're not depending on the senses, you're not speaking, you're not looking, you're not listening, you're not touching, you're not kind of moving through the world. The mind as a whole is kind of subtle. Um, and so both the corner of the mind that's doing the watching and then the mind that's actually meditating, it's all kind of subtle. If but if you're in daily life and the way in which you're watching the mind like a hawk is to avoid screaming at people or avoid, throwing things or avoid saying things that are unkind or avoid aggressive, all of those sorts of things, then it's still a sort of a process of how good we are at catching that impulse, because that impulse itself is an energy moving through the mind, and it itself is starting out quite subtle. It itself is starting out underneath the level of conscious awareness, and then it's kind of moving into conscious awareness and sort of taking control of the speech, of the body, of, as it's moving into more and more of the conscious part of the mind, the coarse part of the mind. So if our introspective awareness isn't so well developed, we're kind of engaging with it maybe right before we say or do something, right after we say or do something, could be relatively far along after we've said or did something that now we regret. But as our introspective awareness again continues to improve, we can become capable of noticing it before we say or do the thing that we don't want to say or do, or even when the mind is just beginning to slip into the desire to say or do something that we ought not say or do. And so the mind then is itself either more like the meditative mind, where we're noticing what's happening on a subtle level, or we're noticing what's happening on a coarse level because our introspective awareness isn't strong enough to notice it earlier in the process of that sort of the falling of those dominoes. So it's, so it can be a couple different things depending on, really just depending on the strength of the introspective awareness that is doing the checking, doing the noticing. But I would say that the corner of the mind that's always, well, I guess it depends on, I would say that the corner of the mind that's doing the checking is kind of the subtle aspect of the mind. But when that alarm is noticed by the mind, that might not be until, it's loud and it's getting our conscious attention. So it can be different things is the best way I could say it, I guess.
I see. Thank you very much.
Can I add or ask in? So this morning you had addressed, and I'm not going to say this right because I'm just thinking of it now, but the impact of like the companions we keep on our experience, and just what you're relaying now about introspective awareness and thinking about a situation that was, not the most pleasant or enjoyable last week, and for me, and so one way to look at it was that when I wasn't discussing it, I could go, okay, there's my view, which isn't the entire picture, it's not their entire reality, and maybe have some compassion for the other person, and also understand that maybe there's parts of me that interacted with the situation, so maybe be reflective. And what I realized is then when I was with friends in a group that meets every week, from what you're saying, it seems like I was more in the course mind because we're discussing at that point. And much easier in that situation to have, it's not even that people mean harm, but to encourage, like, no, this is not on you. They're trying to be kind to me, but actually it almost seems like it's a draw away from introspection that can be beneficial. So trying to draw me away from, shaming myself for something unkind maybe that someone else said, but there's another piece to that could be beneficial. It could be turned around. So that's what I think I'm hearing between this morning and what you've just said, is that has brought me to a coarse mind. So I'll stop.
Anything else? Okay, so day 260, we're going to move into now a section where Lama Zopa, Lama Yeshe are giving us tools again that we need to use to kind of antidotes, tools for tamping down the arising of the delusions that are responsible for creating our samsara. So in day 260, Lama Yeshe, the quote is, "The beauty of being human is that we have the capacity for liberation within us. We come with that ability." So this is again looking at the idea of Buddha nature, Buddha potential, that was one of the first modules that we looked at. And so, of course, every sentient being, regardless of whether they are human or not, has Buddha potential in one way, but in another way of talking, not every sentient being can develop their innate Buddha potential. They can't fan that flame intentionally through effort, through training. And so for a human, the Buddha potential is kind of actionable. It's something that we can actually intentionally cultivate more and more, which is unique to the human realm. And, to some degree, maybe some specific pure lands and things where that can also be developed, but still, it would have to be very specific, with the tantric teachings and so on. So not all of the pure realms, but really the human realm in particular can allow us to, because of the energy system of the body and all of these, and human intelligence and so on, we can really live a life that is different than a life of an animal, or the desire realm gods, the form realm gods, the formless realm, etc. But we have to actually choose to do that. There are any number of human beings, through oppressive outer conditions, through a lack of interest, still, even though they are human, aren't really taking advantage. but through, as he says, having awareness and being able to learn what to adopt, what to discard, and really putting effort into that path. He said it would be a shame to not take advantage of this rare endowment and instead follow our instincts blindly and uncritically. He says, thus, whether what we encounter is good or bad, we should experiment as much as possible with the purest Dharma wisdom knowledge, transforming everything into the everlasting peaceful path to enlightenment. So, transforming all of our experiences, like Dr. Ross is teaching in the Monday night class, transforming even adversity into the path by applying, not just allowing our practice to be intellectual knowledge or the accumulation of, oh, now I can recite this list of however many, and then I just learned this list, or I can name all of the all of the afflictions, and I can name all of the mental factors, but even if we can't name all of them, even if we only know one or two of them, but we apply those one or two and we actually look for the arising of those states in our experience, and we make effort, then that's far more beneficial than just having vast intellectual knowledge. But of course, this idea of experimentation too, it isn't, we have to balance the, understanding with practice too. We have to make sure that we do understand, what does the Buddha mean by hatred, what does the Buddha mean by jealousy, and not just have our own conceptions, our own. So there is certainly an aspect, a critically important aspect, of getting really clear on exactly what the Buddha is teaching, and then once so that we go through the process of the three wisdoms, the wisdom that arises through listening or study, which is where we distinguish, what is the Buddhist understanding of impermanence rather than the colloquial understanding of impermanence. What is the Buddhist understanding of, rebirth rather than, or karma, rather than maybe how it's presented in Hinduism or, some other religious system. And then once we understand on a sort of definitional basis, then we begin to reflect and think, okay, do I, are there gaps in my understanding? How does this relate to other concepts, and so on? And then once we have a real insight that arises through critical reflection, then we can take that insight onto the cushion and really try to internalize it, try to become one with that insight, really sort of soak the mind in that insight. And then, of course, that process will reinforce and is kind of also going to deepen, in and of itself, because we're joining that with single pointed concentration to whatever degree is possible for us. That insight itself will deepen and will sharpen through the process of meditation, and will become refined and more, deeper and yeah. But we do have to. We can't skip any of those stages. We can't just say, "Oh, well, I just want to meditate. I don't want to think about, what does this mean, or what, I don't want to engage in any study." That would be, but we also say, well, I can't only study. I have to also, try to develop some concentration, and I have to take what I'm listening and what I think I'm understanding, into a meditative practice as well. So it's a whole system that is interdependent. And then, he makes that point, he joins kind of those 2 points that he mentioned, sort of, that I've talked about, concentration and wisdom, with the training in morality as well. So Lama Zopa Rinpoche, in day 261, the quotation is, "We cannot become free from samsara without practicing the 3 higher trainings of morality, concentration, and wisdom." And then he says, "How is a disciple guided through the teachings of the Lamrim?" And he mentions that the graduated path is divided into the path of the lower capable being, the middle capable being, and the higher capable being. And then how those are divided into the attitudes of the aim or the goal of cutting off, clinging to just this one life and focusing on good future rebirths, or the attitude of completely turning one's back on samsara, or the attitude of full enlightenment for the benefit of other sentient beings. The 3 scopes, the 3 goals or attitudes of practitioners. So, as we've said before, we're not even a practitioner of the lowest scope or the least capable being until we have abandoned trying to make this life work out, and we care only about our overall spiritual trajectory. We care about completely closing the door to the lower realms at a minimum, and devoting ourselves to creating the causes and conditions of higher realm rebirths, rather than getting caught up in wealth and status and just the trappings of however many more years we have left to live in just this one life. And as we've said, a number of times, that kind of reorientation is extraordinary and profound compared to, from the Buddhist perspective, someone who hasn't even really begun to enter the path. A completely ordinary sentient being who's preoccupied with these mundane concerns of wealth and status and so on. So, morality is the initial vehicle that we use through understanding the law of cause and effect, and then being resolved to avoid non-virtue, to practice virtue. So that kind of orientation to morality is the foundation. And then still we have to, that's not enough, that we could become a wonderful, loving, kind person, and that's great, but that's not sufficient. We have to join that with wisdom, and then ultimately, even still, concentration, and ultimately, at some point, single-pointed concentration, fully qualified calm abiding. If not in this life, in the lifetime in which we achieve enlightenment, we will have to develop single-pointed concentration. So, it's something to at least try to get imprints toward, at least try to move in that direction to set ourselves up. If not in this life, at least we've practiced that intent. At least we've, maybe we've made it by the end of this life to one of the stages, 4th stage, 7th stage, somewhere. And then we've got these imprints that are helpful. At least we make some effort in that direction. Because without single-pointed concentration, the object of the true nature of reality will never appear to the mind. It's too subtle of an object. Other meditative objects, other meditative realizations can be had by a practitioner who's not developed calm abiding, fully qualified. calm abiding, but not the insight into the nature of reality. It's not possible. It's too subtle of an object. So, so we need to join. We need to train in morality and wisdom and concentration. Any thoughts or questions? Yeah.
It seems like the entering of the path, which is an ongoing, in and of itself is graduated, is, I can't say rooted because it's impermanent in its own way. It's like giving up all those, it's a matter of uprooting or giving up concepts that we've had. And I guess I don't really have an exact question form, but there's one kind of formulating about how to increase that devotion. And half of me is like, okay, I think I've heard some of this, but I probably need to continue to hear to, how to develop renunciation, because it's not, it's like I feel little bits and pieces, but I know it's a process. It's not like, oh, I've got this, Thank you.
Yeah. So, I mean, definitely each of the scopes have individual pieces to them, and each scope, each individual contemplation is going to set the stage, for further success in the contemplations. So, I mean, they start, the Tibetans, they, as you're saying, they kind of start with guru devotion as the root of the path, the foundation of the path, seeing the guru as Buddha, is the heart of the path, in one way of speaking, and so there's specific, if you look, and we covered that, just kind of unfortunately a while ago, there's a whole, all of these in the Lamrim, they all have sections devoted to them. So in Yangtze Rinpoche's practicing the path, he'll have a section on it. In the Lamrim Chenmo or the middle length Lamrim, there's a whole section on it. Lama Zopa has a whole book on guru devotion called The Heart of the Path. Which is a wonderful, if you want to study that in the most exquisite detail, probably The Heart of the Path is what, I mean, of course, not to exclude the primary source chapters, but he's got a whole book where he's talking about it. It's also, as you're saying, it is something that I think all of these grow and deepen over a lifetime too. I think that, a person's guru devotion is something that, is never really finished. I think that that's true. I don't think that any of the, I mean, when we develop single pointed concentration, that's also very, very helpful for the other meditative realizations. But when we look at the realizations, there's, even with single pointed concentration, if you look at understanding the nature of reality as an example, you start by a correct inferential understanding before you get to a non-conceptual understanding. So I think with all of these, there are layers to how deeply, we could understand it to a certain level, but then there are deeper levels that are there. And certainly, as I said, meditative concentration plays a role in accessing those deeper levels, but purification plays an incredibly important role. Engaging in meritorious activity, plays a really, critical role. And, centralizing Guru devotion in our practice plays, a role. When we looked at that section, Lama Zopa and Lama Yeshe make it very clear that our success in understanding karma, in understanding impermanence, is rooted in our Guru devotion, which seems unrelated. It seems like, well, if I'm smart enough and I try hard enough, and then I can just do that separately. And they're like, no, it's not possible. That the way that you relate to the people who are teaching you these concepts is the most important thing. And so, yeah, it's in a way kind of counterintuitive to the Western mind or the Western way of thinking, because we feel like it just depends on how smart I am and how much time I spend and how much effort I make. But that's not the experience of the great meditators of the last 2,000 years. That it's actually the depth of our Guru devotion will play a central role in success. And then, like I say, also, they also give a great role to how much time and energy we're putting into purification. And here, like in day 262, Lama Zopa says morality is the essential cause of liberation, just reinforcing what he was saying in the previous contemplation, where yes, we need to get to wisdom and we need to get to concentration, but we won't do that if we are being deceptive, if we are being manipulative, if we are trying to get ahead by whatever means necessary, causing harm to other sentient beings to achieve our interests and our desires, because we're energizing all of the wrong views that are it's the mind of self-grasping, the mind of self-cherishing, that's kind of like the devil on our shoulder that's saying, no, go ahead, just take what you want, do, there aren't any consequences, just go ahead and steal that, or nobody's looking, it's not worth very much, or if you need to manipulate this person into going along with what is good for you, then that's fine. So whenever we give in to those impulses, we strengthen self-grasping, we strengthen self-cherishing, we take ourselves away from the path, we energize all of the wrong things, all of the things that are obscuring the mind. And so without putting effort into countering those impulses, through purification. It's why purification, because purification comes along with the power of restraint. It isn't just, oh yeah, I screwed up and totally fine if I keep doing that. Of course, we have to be somewhat gentle with ourselves and not beat ourselves up, but we try to realistically work with the power of restraint and think, well, okay, I am, like Cameron said, I'm going to watch my mind like a hawk for the next hour, 2 hours. And, that's realistic. That's not overwhelming. I can do that. And so gradually, slowly, I'm going to use this technology of purification to change my patterns, my habits, my impulses, not in a day, not in a week, not in a year, but in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, day by day. And then we calm down. We don't eliminate the afflictions, but we tamp them down. We calm them down, which settles the mind down in turn. It makes the mind less reactive, less kind of needy and grasping, and because there's this restraint. There are these bounds on our activity. We've said, I am not a person who, and that's kind of, he's going to talk about vows, in the next one, day 263. And I was kind of thinking, when I was reflecting on that contemplation, I was kind of thinking, well, it's pretty similar to what cognitive psychologists would also advise people about how to change, this idea where they've given I've read things, and they've said one really effective way of aligning yourself with a goal of whatever, getting up early or exercising more or being healthier, isn't to approach it from the perspective of willpower, because that's not like, oh, I just won't, I'm just going to not, but to tell yourself, I am not a person who does this thing. I am a person who has this other behavior. I am someone who respects my health and my longevity. And so I'm going to choose to engage in actions that align with who I am. Of course, here we're speaking conventionally, not, with empty neo. So it's a conventional way of thinking, but that's kind of the same more mental framework as vows, as taking the vow not to steal, not to lie, not to kill, not to take intoxicants, not to engage in sexual misconduct. You're just saying, this is who I am. This is what I value. This is the kind of person. I am not a person who steals. And so we don't have to think, am I going to steal this or not? Because we're not a person who steals. We are not a person who, and still, it's not magic. It's not like you can't literally flip a switch. We make mistakes, and but it's a better cognitive framework than kind of just leaving it open and then relying on white knuckling our decision making on a momentary basis, without that framework of reconceptualizing just holistically, this is what I do and this is what I don't do. Still, we're going to struggle. We're going to, we're going to find it. But as a framework, it makes it easier. It makes it more feasible, more effective, to work in that way. And like he says, the quotation is, vows give us responsibility. They add weight to our determination. He says the essential thing is to protect our karma, and there's no surer way of doing that than taking vows. So whether it's the 5 lay vows, or the one-day vows, or the bodhisattva vows, or the tantric vows, he says, we gain great benefit when we refrain from even one small non-virtue. So then, of course, when we talked before, when we adopt vows, it's different. It's also different than, because we have now said, I am a person who does not do these things. And so holding our, if we take that seriously and we hold ourselves in that way, then there's kind of a momentum to holding ourselves in that way that's present in the mind, even in the absence of individual temptations. We might be free for a period of time of individual impulses to kill insects or bugs or cockroaches, or and so if we haven't taken the vow not to kill, then because we're free of those individual opportunities, we're not collecting any virtuous karma. But if we've taken if we take ourselves to be someone who does not kill, then even in the absence of opportunities to kill, we are still maintaining this kind of momentum away from killing. Of course, we also have to uphold it when there are temptations to kill, when we do. And then we, if we make a mistake, we do have to, we ought to purify that, and we ought to then take that as the basis for training in, using the power of restraint and, really, so still we make mistakes. But there's this kind of imprint, and this he says, it propels us. It gives us this momentum, strengthens the mind, he says. And then, it also, he talks about this idea of responsibility. We've taken this vow voluntarily. No one told us to. No one made us do it. No one was holding a gun to our head. We decided. It aligns with who we want to be, and then we take a vow in front of our teacher and really before the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and so that gives us a sense of responsibility. Again, we don't beat ourselves up. We don't freak out when we inevitably engage in some transgression, but we take it seriously enough that we purify that transgression, that we don't hold it as meaningless, that we don't hold it as well, anybody would have done that in my situation, maybe, but we are holding ourselves to a particular standard, and so at least we recognize the need to purify. I think you asked a question, and I think I don't know, that was a long time ago. It was like an hour ago. Maybe you asked something. I was just going on and on.
No, that's all so instructive and helpful. And of course, more questions come up, but I don't want to, I'm glad that you segued that beautifully into the vows. It's all new. There's so much to learn. So thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions?
I have a question, but I feel like it can become distracting if I continue. So is it okay as kind of a Lamrim student if I perhaps email? I don't want to overwhelm your duties outside this. So if it's okay, I will email it.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
So then in day 264, Lama Zopa is helping us to understand the real meaning of renunciation, or also definite emergence, the wish to definitely emerge from suffering, which he says means renouncing the cause of suffering. It does not mean, he says, turning our back on our friends and family or giving away everything. He says we don't have to make a huge bonfire of our clothes or throw away our books and CDs. But we should be unattached to these things. We shouldn't think that they are the cause of our happiness. And, could be, as we've said, in the last couple classes, sometimes we may need to maintain a respectful distance from some things, which is a statement about where our own mind is just at the moment. It isn't really a statement about what renunciation means, because if our mind is stronger, then that object or relating to that object isn't of any concern. But we may, with some things, think, for now, I should create some distance, because my attraction, my attachment is, if I'm actually around that, then I can't really have a more reasonable relationship. For some objects, it just doesn't work for me right now. But that doesn't mean always. That doesn't mean, and that can also be true of maybe certain relationships. We may, if it just seems like it's overwhelmingly, negative, we might feel like I can't bring this onto the path. I can't transform this. And so I need to protect myself. I need to, but that, again, that doesn't mean I will always be like that. At some point, if I was like His Holiness, or if I was, then I could totally, interact with that person and it would be fine, but I'm not. And so it's too much for me right now. But we hold in our mind at the same time that that's not really renunciation, that that's not the actual meaning of renunciation, and that my capacity can evolve, and that I want it to evolve. I want to be someone, and maybe for some things it's not going to in this life. Like, I don't know if it's healthy necessarily. Like, if someone's truly like an alcoholic, maybe it isn't healthy for them to say, "Oh, I hope in 20 years I can be in a bar." Like, I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not an addiction, but Venerable Urbina says we're all addicts, and it's just a question of, is the degree. Like, alcohol is physically a poison, so you can die in a few years, whereas, we can get by with food and other things. And, I mean, that can also be, some people are also 700, 800, 900 pounds, and that can also be really awful. But, there's a normalized range from the Buddhist perspective is still really unhealthy compared to what's possible, compared to the kind of freedom from attachment that's possible. There's a normalized range that many people would think is totally reasonable, and from the Buddhist perspective, it's suffering. From the Buddhist perspective, it's being so attached that the mind is deeply painful compared to the kind of freedom enjoyed by enlightened beings. But so yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that with regard to all things, we want to think about it in terms of, well, because then we might just be setting ourselves up for failure if we really genuinely, truly have a deeply unhealthy relationship with something. Could be we just say, I'm done, for the rest of my life, I'm done. I won't. That's possible. And we shouldn't think of that that's a failure. We just think I'm making time and space in my mind for better things, more important things. So that's a very personal, I think that's also just a very personal thing that we all individually have to think a lot about, and come to decisions with wisdom, in our own lives about how to navigate those things. But yeah, it isn't, just the not having or the not doing isn't renunciation, because you can be miserable not having and not doing. And if you're miserable not having and not doing, you don't have renunciation. You're just self-flagellating. You're just like, you're not actually working on the underlying attachment. You're just separating yourself and you're wallowing in misery. If you're not joyful in giving away or separating, then just because you've like, oh, this doesn't suit me anymore, this isn't beneficial, and so I'm happy to be separate from it because it's only suffering. If we can have that kind of mind, then great. But if we are like, well, I should, but this is horrible and this is miserable and I'm so upset, I'm so depressed, then that's a sign that we haven't really gotten to the underlying attachment that we need to still work on. Maybe that's a bit better. Still, I think it's maybe a bit better, if we go back to the analogy of alcoholism, probably for the alcoholic, better to be upset that they're not drinking than to just keep drinking. I'm not suggesting that. But if you are upset, then that's just a sign that still, even though you've separated, there's more that needs to happen, because it isn't happening joyously. It isn't happening out of a genuine recognition that this is no longer serving me, and I just don't want it. I just don't, like, why would I bring that into my experience? Why would I make myself suffer? So understanding, and this of course goes back to understanding the Four Noble Truths in a really deep way, understanding the suffering, what changeable suffering, really is, and how there is no happiness to be found in the object, and how it's a mistake that bringing the object into our experience and feeling as though our happiness depends upon contact with the object that never ceases, how that's a deluded and suffering state of mind to be indulging in. Of course, all of this is very difficult, but nevertheless, it's the path. Thoughts or questions? Okay, so we'll leave it there with day 264. Unfortunately, we don't have class this Thursday. I believe it's canceled on the schedule. There's a team meeting that I will be attending. The director will be here. Shayla happily will be here in Santa Fe. So there's a team meeting with people that's going to be happening on Thursday. So I'll be doing that instead of being here. And Shayla will be doing that instead of being here. So
I'm excited.
any final thoughts or questions? Okay, so we'll end with dedication. So we recollect the altruistic intention that we established at the beginning. I think that by having listened and contemplated, we've actualized that intention, which has created positive energy in the mind. I think that positive energy will ripen in beneficial ways. And we want to seal that positive energy in the most beneficial, most spiritually supportive ways. So think about how you would like to offer the fruit of your practice in those spiritually beneficial ways, and also opening our hearts to the suffering happening in Morocco and all around the world, all of the various sufferings, using that as fuel for our practice, recognizing that by becoming enlightened, we can be of benefit in those circumstances, and turning away from the suffering of samsara, orienting ourselves toward that. All right. So, fortunately, again, it'll be a whole week. We will resume on the 18th.
Thank you, Venerable.